Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Today we're going to be talking about something that is happening in China right now. China has been in the news for the last year, and of course, the reason the China virus, Wuhan virus, coronavirus, COVID-19, whatever you want to call it, China has been in the news for a lot of different reasons, but that's probably the biggest reason China's been in the news. But what I want to talk about today is not COVID-19. I don't want to talk about the virus and whether it was manufactured in China or whether it was intentionally manufactured or not. That's a whole different other issue. We may cover that issue at some other program. And the issue basically, I don't want to get into this, but I'll state it. China is a communist, atheistic country. They don't believe in any higher reality than the material world. They don't believe in heaven. They don't believe in hell. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in angels. They don't believe in miracles. Everything is just on this earthly level, and we are simply higher animals in the food chain. We are part of this so-called Darwinian process, and China is just a atheistic, communistic, materialistic state, totalitarian state. And so the way they believe people need to be treated is like cattle. And that's exactly what they do in their country. So when you look at something like COVID-19 that originated in Wuhan, China, you have to ask yourself, could this possibly have been manufactured in a laboratory? And we know that this COVID-19 essentially is high risk to senior citizens and the elderly and people with predispositions of sicknesses. And the question would be, well, was this manufactured to silently and secretly kill off the older people in society and thus saving money for entitlement programs such as food, housing, healthcare, and other areas that the government is now expending on the elderly. And so this virus essentially cuts off the older population, saving billions and billions of Chinese money in the process. Now, that is such a dark, cynical idea that it's one that you would hope would never, ever be carried out as a plan. But you're also dealing with a government that is an atheistic, secular, materialistic government that has already killed millions and tens of millions of its own people in even the recent history, just 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so nothing is beyond possibility as far as the brutality and bloodthirstiness of the Chinese government. They'll do whatever they want to do because they have no higher authority than themselves, they believe. And there's no God, so they don't believe that there's any accountability. But we as Christians know that there will be a day when everyone who implemented policies in China and that resulted in the deaths of millions of Chinese, they will be judged. But I don't want to talk about that aspect of the Chinese totalitarian system. What I want to talk about today is what they're implementing now since last year, 2020. Officially, they rolled out their so-called social credit system. This social credit system is preposterous. This is such a gross violation of human rights. It's such a manipulative, controlling tool by the arm of the centralized government that it is so shocking to us as freedom-loving Americans and freedom lovers in the Western world. What the system is, let me explain it first and show you the implications of this terrible system. If the Chinese government, as far as I can tell, they start out with each citizen receiving 1,000 points. And if you think of this as a credit score, you will begin to think of it in simplified terms that we have here in the United States. Everyone gets a credit score based on their financial situation as far as their ability to pay back loans and financial arrangements. Now, the higher your credit score, the better it is for you to borrow money from a bank. You can buy a car at a dealership. You can buy a new home. You can take out a mortgage. You can get a home equity loan. It really affects how and what you can do financially if you have a higher credit score. If you have a lower credit score, then you can't do many of these things. Well, the Chinese social credit score is similar in the sense that you start out with 1,000 points, and then the government has this system set up where things that you do and say and even think will add to or take away from your social credit score. And when you have negative social credit score points, it brings your total down and it limits what you can do in society. It will actually limit where you can go. You can't board a train if you have a certain lower credit score, not credit score, but social credit score. You can't get in, your children can't get into schools if you have too low a social credit standing. You can't apply for certain jobs with a low social credit score, or you will lose your job if your social credit score dips below a certain level. So it's a very manipulative system. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, no, you're joking, right? This is not true. This government can't be that manipulating and controlling and conniving and scheming. That something's wrong here. No, I'm actually telling you a system that was rolled out in 2020, last year. Now, they had been experimenting with this in, I think, about 5 or 6 cities across China for the last few years. But last year, 2020, was the year that they were supposed to have rolled this out. I believe they have. Last year was when it went and applied to the entire nation of China. And they're still fine-tuning the system, and it could change from time to time. Again, you can do that if you're a totalitarian dictatorship, and if you're a communist centralized big government state, you can do whatever you want. So what they do is they tell the citizens, if you are a good citizen and do exactly what the Communist Party says to do, what Chinese government says to do, you will be okay. You will be able to have your freedoms. You will be able to go places and do things as long as you don't have a low credit score, social credit score on your tally. But if you do things that are against the government, for example, there are negative things that you can do that lowers the score. There are positive things that you can do that raise the social credit score. Some of the basic features of the system are made to build into the Chinese people an inner motivation for being good Chinese communist citizens. For example, if you speak against the Communist Party or Xi Jinping, or if you speak against a policy and someone hears you in public or at your work or even in your family, or you're across your fence and your neighbor hears it, your neighbor can get 5 points positive for turning you in, for reporting on you, for snitching on you, for tattling on you. You, in turn, get 5 points negative for what you said. If you said, I don't like this social credit system, it's manipulative and controlling, and they're treating us like cattle, and your neighbor hears you, he can call it in or he can text it in on his smartphone that you, his neighbor, and he gives the name and address, spoke ill of the Communist Party social credit system. 5 points appears on his social credit score. And then the next day, 5 points is taken away from your social credit score, and it says, because you spoke ill of the Communist Party. And so what that does is it puts a chilling effect on the entire population. They say, well, I better not speak ill of the Communist Party. And so they're trying to internalize censorship so you don't speak out. There are just hundreds and hundreds of things that you can do that you can get points taken away. One of the big concerns for Christians in China is that they have all kinds of laws against unauthorized meetings. They have all kinds of laws against indoctrinating your children with superstition, they call it. Remember, they're atheists, communists, Darwinians. All religion, according to the official Chinese Communist Party platform, are superstitions. And they're damaging. They're dangerous superstitions. They poison the minds of people. See, the Communist Party wants to make you a good materialist, an atheist, a communist. And if you or your children believe in God, you are a threat to the state because therefore you have a higher power. You can judge the state by that higher power. And the state wants top billing in your life. And so you can have social credit points taken away for attending an unauthorized meeting or attending an unauthorized church or trying to convert someone from atheism to Christianity. So if you approach someone in the street, totally different from here in our country today. But the danger is that our country could look across and say, wow, they're doing a social credit system. Let's do some form of that. And we already see in the censorship of, for example, at YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, we're seeing a type of internalizing. They're trying to get the users of these platforms to internalize their policies against certain topics. You can't talk about certain topics. You can't talk about alternative medicine for COVID-19. You can't question the mask mandates coming down from Joe Biden's government because big tech, Facebook, YouTube, Google, Instagram, Twitter, they will take down your comments. And if you keep commenting on forbidden topics, they will actually deplatform you. They will take you down. There are thousands of YouTube channels that have been removed because people have talked about forbidden topics. This has never been done before in the United States. So what I'm saying is the United States, you might think, well, this could never happen in the United States. This social credit score could never happen in the United States. It couldn't happen overnight, but it's already starting to happen. The censorship, the cancel culture, this is all tied together. So in China, they have a totalitarian government and they don't have the civil liberties that we have in the United States. So the government can do whatever it wants. And so it's implementing this highly centralized, controlled, manipulative, scheming, maneuvering, pressuring citizens to be good communists. And so what's really hard is that the Christian church is going to suffer, and pastors and even regular Christians are going to suffer because, of course, they must follow God rather than man. That's what the disciples told the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem when they were told, you cannot preach the gospel. You cannot try to convert your fellow Jews to Christianity. You cannot tell people that Jesus rose from the dead. And the disciples just told the Jewish leaders, we must obey God rather than man. We have a higher calling and we have a higher power that we have to answer to. And so you, a mere man, cannot tell us what to do because we will do what our God tells us to do. And they didn't like that. And the Chinese government doesn't like that either. The problem is the Chinese government is more sophisticated, and they have a surveillance state now where they can monitor and observe all of these infractions. China right now has over 200 million cameras, color, high definition CCTVs that are on street lamps and street posts and in every building that you can imagine, on every street, every town square. They have blanketed that country, especially the big cities, with surveillance cameras. And their plan is to have close to 1 billion cameras located all over the country that all go back and collect data. And you have people in buildings, high-rise buildings, monitoring all these cameras. And if you do anything out of line, they can take negative points off your credit score. Now, what happens? If you get below a certain level on your credit score, your social credit score, if you attend an unauthorized church meeting, if you try to solicit to convert someone and they report you, if you distribute unauthorized Bibles, if you do all kinds of offenses involved with your Christian faith, if you get so many points taken off, it's hard for you to actually get a job in China. It's hard for you to own a home in China. It's hard for you to buy a car in China. Hard for you to use a train or a bus, because everything is linked together, and you have to show and prove oftentimes that you have a social credit score high enough to use these things. You can't get on an airplane. There are millions of people right now that have low enough credit scores, social credit standing scores, that they cannot fly in an airplane in China because they just simply don't meet the level of acceptable score to travel. So you're essentially isolated from the rest of the world. If you are a professor at a university and you get a low enough credit score, they actually take away your credentials. If you have a PhD, the Chinese state government will strip that credential from you. You cannot work at a university or college in China, and therefore your whole career is ruined. Now, we're not even talking about the re-education camps that they have. We're not even talking about the prison camps that they have in China. That's a whole separate subject. But you are considered an enemy of the state if your credit score drops below a certain level. Now, what happens if you try to be the ideal model communist? Well, then your credit score rises. If you say good things about the policies, if you say only positive things about President Xi, if you say only glowing reviews of communist policies, and you send emails and text messages that just glorify the Communist Party, you will be rewarded and your credit score will go up. If you are critical of anything concerned and connected with the Communist Party or its leadership, even in text messages and emails, on your own computer, if you've written anything, a blog post, social media post, you will receive a demerit and scores will be lowered on your social credit score. And this is how they will manipulate the population. And the younger generation in China, it's being reported, is going along with this because they want to have fun and they want to have food and they want to have their own apartment and they want to have their cars and careers. And so they're going to follow along with the state manipulation. But the older people who had a little more freedom before, they're resisting this, and it's going to be difficult for them because, here again, their state dominates their entire life. And so you have a state pension that comes in, the government administrates that. You have state-controlled health care. And There are so many levers that the state can pull to manipulate even the older generation into compliance. They can take away your pension, they can start reducing your living expenses, your retirement, they can start removing health care benefits from you. They can limit you in travel so you won't be able to see your family members and grandchildren and children, and they can begin to put the squeeze on you to, at least in public and in every single open forum, say good things about the state. This is nothing less than 1984, George Orwell's Big Brother state, happening right before our very eyes. We see this happening. This is not a theory. This is not a fiction book written by a famous author. This is real life. This is happening in China right now. And parts of it, aspects of it, are being borrowed and copied and used in our country right now. And that's why, as Christians, we have to be willing to have this all worked out in our head. What happens if the state begins to put the squeeze on us and tells us that we can't speak of our faith in public, or we can't make any text message comments about Christianity, or we can't speak of trying to convert someone to our faith? We have to work this out. You have to work this out in your head and with your church, and you have to say, am I willing to suffer for Christ? Am I willing to suffer for the Christian gospel? Am I willing to stand up to the state and say, no, I will not go this far? What happens if the state tells you that you have to be vaccinated for COVID-19? And that if you're not vaccinated for COVID-19, if you're not willing to let the state pump chemicals into you, if you're not willing to let the government pump untested new technology into your veins, are you willing to suffer a loss? Because that's what will happen. There may come a day where you can't go into certain public buildings. If you have a court appearance and you're not vaccinated, they will not let you into court. And if you can't get into court, you may lose your court case. You may have to pay a huge fine, or you may actually have to go to jail because you can't go places because you haven't been vaccinated, because you didn't want to have the government tell you that you needed to be pumped with these chemicals. Now you might say, well, what's the big deal about the vaccination? Why not just go along? It's probably up and up and everything's fine. The problem is, and if you've read the history of the literature on this subject, if you're familiar with, for example, A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, if you're familiar with the futuristic scenarios that have been written about, one of the scenarios is that we live in a society in the future where they put chemicals in the water system to make people less aggressive. So they domesticate people. The government, for example, a state government, a totalitarian government like China right now. Let's say that the Chinese communist leadership feels that there's too much male aggression in society. There's too much crime. There's too much fighting. There's too many people who disagree with the government. What if they have found a chemical that could be put in the water system that would make people more domestic, that would be more of a tranquilizer, that would prevent people from, for example, fighting or being violent, or just sort of put an edge on all more anger and frustration and all of these negative behaviors? What if they said, okay, let's do that. Let's experiment in one little city and see how that goes. And let's say the results are okay as far as the state goes, or good, that crime is down, fighting is down, violent aggression is down. So they expand it. And finally it becomes the whole country, where there is a chemical that's put in the water supply. Or let's say that in the annual vaccines, take for instance, maybe they have a flu vaccine And they're going to roll all of these vaccines into one. And so it's not going to be just the annual flu vaccine. It's going to be the flu, COVID, and all these other harmful medical conditions. And so they say, we want everyone to take this vaccine. And at the same time, they put in the chemicals that will domesticate people. And from a state standpoint, that makes a lot of sense because the state's about control and about managing people. And so they put an edge on all the aggressive behavior and turn the men into sort of domestic people. And do you really want that happening? And that's where mandated vaccines can actually take on that sinister turn. And so we don't want mandated vaccines. We don't ever want to have a government anywhere, especially in the U.S. They're going to do it in China, and we can't do anything about it. But here in this country, we will not stand for mandated vaccines because that's when the state can control. And we see already this social credit score in China is going to really put a freeze on Christianity there for people who are not willing to resist the state. It is going to be very difficult for Christians over there to do evangelism, to disciple their children. If the state feels you're telling your children superstitions, they may take your children away from you. They'll use this social credit standing as a pretext and say, well, we're just trying to protect the children from unpatriotic people, or whatever the pretext would be. Here in the United States, we're seeing this censorship with Facebook and YouTube and Google. We're seeing the mainstream media actually take a partisan role in elections, actually not reporting on specific things that are happening because that might be damaging to the candidate they're favoring at ABC and CBS and CNN and NBC. We're seeing a lot of the high-tech manipulation already taking place in our country. And as Christians, we need to be prepared for a time, possibly in the near future, where we are going to be pressured and persecuted for what we believe, for our Christian biblical convictions. We're going to be pressured to compromise and conform to agree with the prevailing worldview of the government and big tech and academia and education and law and all over the place. The culture is going to get to the point where they're going to put the squeeze on us as Christians, and we have to decide right away, are we going to stand strong or are we going to cave? And I would say that we need to prepare ourselves. We need to begin to train ourselves in means of resistance, because if we cave, if we simply roll over and submit ourselves to the state or to the big corporations that are pressuring us, we are no better than those Christians who were willing to burn a pinch of incense to Caesar. It's going to come down literally to, are we followers of the Lord Jesus Christ or of Caesar? And you have to make that determination in your own heart. And it's best to make it now while you can, where you have time to think, because it's coming. It is coming here, whether we want to admit it or not. Well, I hope that's something to think about, and we'll talk to you next week on the same program. God bless.